welcome back to the Backcountry Manifesto podcast. I'm your buddy Al West, Hayden Samak, and today we're talking to a friend of the show, Peter Mancall, Dr. Peter Mancall. He is the author of Fatal Journey, the final expedition of Henry Hudson. You're on the show today to talk about your new book. But first, tell me what you do at USC. Tell me why you do it. And then tell me about the ways, I guess, in which you've been doing it, you know?
All right. Well, those are great questions. I'm glad we're on a couch because I feel like, I've got to stretch out and give therapy now about why I do it. But basically, I'm a historian of the early part of the early American experience. So when we talk about early America, we typically talk about the period that goes up to, say, from Columbus through the American Revolution. Mm-hmm. That's early America.
Sure.
And then after you get to the Constitution, then you're in the next period, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm a historian not only of early America in that sense, but of the early part of it. So basically, I teach my students, I work with my students to understand the world between, say, the mid-15th century and the end of the 17th century, the period that is really left out of a lot of our understanding about American history.
So you were saying that you work with your students.
So I work with my students, basically try to understand the early period, like how we got to what we think of as America.
Yeah.
Which is really the theme of this book I have coming out called Contested Continent, like how did we get to America? But before we talk about that, so I just got into this because the questions interested me. I didn't really know much about early America until I got to graduate school. And then I was very taken by a professor I had. I became one of his students. He was a very renowned professor named Bernard Balin, and became one of his students. And I started off, like many of his students, working on the 18th century. I did that for a while. I wrote my first thing about the Susquehanna Valley.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Over the course of the 18th century. And then mostly about interactions between the native peoples of that area and the Europeans who came in. And then that fed me. I was really caught by something that was a common phenomenon, which is how often colonists were selling alcohol to native peoples, which we tend to think was them trying to take advantage of them, which absolutely was the case. But it was also a more complicated story. So then I wrote a book about the alcohol trade and tried to understand that as a business and what that meant for native peoples, what it meant for Europeans. And that book I wrote when I was living in Lawrence, Kansas. I was a faculty member at the University of Kansas then. And Lawrence, Kansas not only has University of Kansas in it, but it has what is now Haskell Indian Nations University. And so that book I could sort of write in having sort of real-time discussions with the students at Haskell and some of the faculty at Haskell about sort of, what does it mean to tell a story about this really destructive commerce? Because I've taken it, I think many historians, I certainly take it seriously. I don't want to create work that has a destructive impact on current peoples. Like I'm writing about things that happened a long time ago. I don't want to say anything destructive. And so when I was writing that book about alcohol, one of the sort of common tropes that people talked about was, this is about genetics, that native peoples generally have this genetic predisposition towards alcohol abuse. Well, that's, could that be true in some individual circumstances? Yes, in the sense that some individuals may have a genetic predisposition towards alcohol abuse. But I explained this as a historical process. I explained why the alcohol trade developed.
I think that'd be kind of interesting to our listeners. Can you talk about it a little bit?
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to. I mean, so it's not the overall is not that complicated a story. Europeans come to Eastern North America. English and French are the primary Europeans I'm writing about in that book. The Dutch are in there a little bit. They come to Eastern North America. They want to extract resources. And one of the resources that they really want are furs. And the fur that they really want is beaver, because that is the most valuable fur. Although the fur trade is so aggressive that it quickly undermines the beaver population. Because beaver, one of the fun things about beaver is they manage the size of their own population. Right? So they're not like other animals, just breed and breed. It's not like deer. There's millions of white-tailed deer in Eastern North America, and people could catch deer. But beaver were harder. But one of the things that Europeans figured out early on is, though they could, in theory, find beaver because they make lodges in ponds, it was much better to have native people find them. And so then the Europeans were like, hey, what can we trade? What can we incentivize you to go produce the beaver? And it wasn't just beaver. There was otter and there were other things, but basically fur-bearing animals. Okay, so you meet people and you have all these shiny new things that they don't have, and they have something that you want. And so you sort of start to offer things that people, for whatever reason, are not producing on their own. So it could be a mirror, it could be an axe, it could be a copper kettle. It could be all these things that for whatever reason, some population of people find useful and then refashion for their own purpose. So a copper kettle was useful for people who spent some of the year farming and some of the year hunting because it was a lot easier to transport into the woods for the winter hunt, and it was less likely to break than a ceramic one. But you could also chop up a copper kettle to make arrowheads, and they would last longer and be easier in some sense use than stone arrowheads, right? So people refashion things. Right? So Europeans and native peoples find ways to trade, and I think, like in any commerce, everyone thinks they're getting the better end of the deal. This is a good price for something, right? And you can see them haggling, which is very cool. In some of these documents, these sort of great things.
What do you like so much about it?
I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is John Adams, founder, president. John Adams in his diary would often tell jokes.
Okay. Oh, really?
Yeah. Little known thing about he was. Everyone thinks Franklin was very funny. Franklin was funny, but John Adams had a wicked sense of humor. I mean, he had a phenomenally sharp sense of humor. Adams is writing at the end of the 18th century, and at that point, the liquor trade, which we'll come back to, the liquor trade is already well established. But one of the ways, if you make alcohol, and they're selling basically rum in the English colonies and brandy in Canada. If you make alcohol and you want to trade it, you're going to make more money if you get the rum and then you water it down. Right? And you're watering it down and you're selling basically this grog, this kind of imperfect substance, but to people who the seller thinks don't know better. Right? And so there's this tradition of watering down rum. So that exists kind of in the background. And John Adams wants to tell a story about what he sees as Native American natural intelligence. So he writes in his diary about a native man going into a pub in Connecticut or Massachusetts. And he comes in and he buys a drink, and the drink costs, 2 shillings. And he buys a drink and he goes away. And then a few months later, he comes back, same place, and the guy charges him like 3 or 4 shillings. And Adams writes, and Adams could have made this up for all we know, right? Adams writes that this man says, I was in here a few months ago and it only cost 2 shillings, and now you're charging me more. Like, what's going on? And the guy, the pub keeper basically says, look, imagine you came to me with a horse and you left your horse with me for a couple of days to take care of it. I would charge you something. But if I had to keep that horse over the winter and it cost me a lot more money, I'd have to charge you more when you came back. And the guy says, the guy says, well, I don't know about how much that horse ate, but I can tell you that this rum certainly drank a lot of water. So this, and Adams, right? This is an example of like American humor. It's a great story, right? So, but it's based on this idea of colonists taking advantage of native peoples. So basically, colonists start to develop the rum trade around the middle of the 17th century, and they are in the area where I basically study, which is Eastern North America. There's no tradition of alcohol among these indigenous peoples.
Really?
There's some alcohol elsewhere in the continent, but not in this broad region in Eastern North America.
I feel like a lot of folks running into alcohol, as much as it becomes intentional, a lot of times it's incidental because,
because things ferment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Invariably, that happened.
Like somebody had to make some pawpaw booze in like the Susquehanna Valley.
One would think that this did happen, but the prevailing understanding and my understanding is this population, which was not accustomed to drinking alcohol, when starting to drink, alcohol has obviously physical sensations and changes your perceptions about things.
They're like, this is poisonous.
And well, there are peoples in the Americas who think, no, this is putting us in touch with like divine forces. So there is tradition of alcohol drinking in Mexico and in the Southwest. And it was very carefully constructed within rituals. So only certain people could drink. There's one ritual, I forget now which indigenous nation in the Southwest, one ritual in an area which is really dry, where they could drink pulque, this fermented plant, one day a year. And they had to drink until the point of collapse that one day a year, because however much that community drank in the year, that's how much rain they would get. But if you drank on other days of the year, you were violating the spiritual compact. Aztecs and Mayans executed people who drank, who were not allowed to be drinkers. In Eastern North America, those traditions don't exist. And so Europeans are basically introducing alcohol at the same time that they're introducing other things: Christianity, European-style clothing, European ideas about how economies should operate. They're trying to change Native peoples into Europeans. And part of the way you do that is you get people to buy what you're selling. So that makes sense as long as you're selling something that people want. But there are only so many copper kettles that somebody wants. There are only so many axes that somebody wants. There are only so many European shirts that somebody wants, especially if you're in a population that moves across the landscape from a farming area in the spring through the summer harvest and into the woods, because you only want as much as you can carry. So then the Europeans kind of have a problem. We want the beaver. We want these other furs. They're better. Native peoples are better than us, Europeans, at getting it. What do? Alcohol is the perfect trade good for Europeans, because to give it to someone, they consume it. And if they don't produce it, they have to keep coming back for it. Right? So the alcohol trade becomes a way to sell one of the products that enslaved Africans are producing in the West Indies on sugar plantations, and gets distilled into rum or into brandy and then sold to native peoples. And so you see all these connections. And so I wrote this book, which is called Deadly Medicine, which is a phrase from the Delaware prophet Neolin in the 1760s, who refers to alcohol as a deadly medicine, i.e. this is killing us. And I write about a native temperance movement, which is about indigenous values, not just about Christianity. And so I spun that up. So I write that book, and now
I bet you as soon as they started getting those people really involved with the drinking, and realized that they were on the hook, they probably stopped selling those copper kettles pretty much immediately, because all you got to do is put a couple of those things together with a hose in between, and now you're distilling your own shit.
Well, I hadn't thought about that. It would have been a good thing to include. Well, whatever. Too bad. That would have been great.
Second edition.
Second edition. The colonists, the English colonists, understood that the alcohol trade was destructive, and each colony sort of outlaws it, says, oh, no, we can't sell alcohol to native peoples. The colonists are drinking huge amounts of liquor. I mean, just a drink per capita drinking in America among European Americans in the late 18th to 19th century is the highest it's ever is in American history. They're drinking the equivalent, according to one estimate, of something like everyone over 15, everyone is drinking the average of like 7 shots a day of 100 proof rum, right? A day. Now that includes everyone. And some of those people aren't drinking. So some people are drinking a lot. In 1737, Benjamin Franklin publishes in Philadelphia something he calls the Drinker's Gazette, which are hundreds of terms to refer to inebriation. Literally hundreds of terms that refer to inebriation. Anyway, going back to this.
Do you have any favorites?
He's been to see the Pharaoh.
He's been to see them.
What is that supposed to mean?
I'm referring to it from that. I prefer, one of my favorite is schnockered. It was real schnockered. Okay, so.
Yeah, Franklin would have had that and many, many others.
Yeah. Okay, anyhow.
Anyway, so the colonies all say this is bad for our relations with native peoples. We should make it illegal.
Yeah.
And they do pass laws, but the trade still continues. And ultimately it continues because they realize that it's better for colonial officials to turn a blind eye to it and make money regardless of the consequences for Native peoples. So at one point, a very prominent colonist named Sir William Johnson, he's the superintendent of Indian affairs for the northern colonies in British North America. He basically says, the trade is terrible. He has tons of examples of it being terrible. He sees violence going on.
Sure.
He hears about accidents, murders, terrible things happening. But he says, but if we don't do it, if we don't sell them alcohol, they won't trade with us. And so not only does that have an present economic problems for the colonists, it also undermines one of Europeans' overarching things, which is to turn Native peoples into Europeans. And Johnson says it will make them indolent. It will make them lazy. And we need to teach them our economic values. So he's basically saying, let's do something that's illegal, because in the very act of buying and consuming, they're starting to act more like us as consumers, and they'll be more easier to convert to our ways of life. So it operates on all these different levels. So I studied that for a few years.
Super insidious.
Completely insidious. It's the most destructive trade in early America.
Would it be like something akin to kind of like the opium trade?
It was exactly akin to the opium trade. And I was writing this in the 90s when America was having big discussions about the crack epidemic. It is a dominant population using a substance to keep other people subordinate. I mean, that sounds like there's a hand guiding things, which wasn't the case, but everyone is operating. They knew what was going on.
Yeah. Well, if there's a system, like a lot of people don't, it's kind of like how we were talking about, you can cook a steak without knowing about the Maillard reaction. It's like, if you're building these things on this scaffolding, whether or not you're a voluntary or you're complicit in it in some, way that's not based in naivete, you're still complicit in it. Like you're still kind of building on that infrastructure.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so it's their way of thinking. And so after doing that book, I really got into why do they think this is okay? Why is this behavior, which they recognize as wrong, drunkenness, watching terrible things happen to people, why do they participate in it? And I wanted to get at the deeper attitudes about how colonization worked, basically.
Sure.
And so that sent me back in time, back into the 16th century, which is when the English really sort of articulate a plan for North America, and then Contested Continent grew out of a series of projects that I did. I wrote a book about a guy named Richard Hakluyt, who was, among other things, a promoter of the colonization of North America in a series of books that he publishes in the 1580s and 1590s. So I wrote a long academic study of him.
There's some water right there if you wanted the lemon.
Yeah, good idea.
Yeah.
And then that fed directly into Hudson, where I wanted to move from sort of why did English colonize to what did that mean on the ground, on the water and on the ground, literally on the water. Sorry about that.
That's
on
good.
the water and on the ground in the early 17th century, or late 16th and the early 17th century. And then that story then spun out ultimately into Contested Continent. I mean, there were some steps along the road. I wrote a book about a guy named Thomas Morton, who is one of my favorite characters. He's kicked out of New England 3 times by the Pilgrims and the Puritans because he's just such a troublemaking asshole, and he's fantastic. And he's just a great character to write a book about. So I was writing about that. And anyway, so Contested Continent is now my understanding of basically how European colonization works in North America.
Cool.
At the end of the day, and looking at its deep history and then taking it forward. And then Henry Hudson, who of course is in Contested Continent, and this guy Thomas Morton is in Contested Continent. I try to tell this basically 700-year story from about the year 1000, the turn of the first Christian millennium, until 1680, which is the year of the Pueblo Revolt in New Mexico. And I try to make sense of the story and to sort of get at these bigger questions about what is America. And so I was sort of thinking about how to tell aspects of that story when the invitation came to join this renowned series of narrative histories. And the thing about being a professor is we are trained not to write narrative history. We are trained to be analytical, right? We are social scientists. We might think of ourselves as humanists, and you can debate what that means forever. But basically, we look at evidence and we interpret it. And I think there's something to be said for people trained to look at evidence in certain ways, like a paleontologist is trained to look at evidence. It doesn't mean the only stories you can tell are by people who have PhDs.
Right.
So when I started playing around with writing narrative, so this book on Hakluyt I mentioned, The Academic, is a narrative. The book on Hudson is a straight up narrative. This book I wrote about Thomas and Morton is pretty much a straight up narrative. And so it got me to think about things in a more, I hope, more publicly friendly way by just thinking about how to tell stories.
Well, this is a super cool way to organize and introduce what we're going to talk about, I guess, now, which would be, Henry Hudson from when he kind of breaks on the scene to his final expedition, the Fatal Journey. And from there, I mean, I feel like that's going to be so great because it'll give us like kind of a vignette of some of the kind of stuff. Now, of course, this is a full-length book on Henry Hudson, Contested Continent, also a full-length book, but every anecdote and every character can't have their full book within it.
Correct.
But it kind of, I feel like it works because it gives you an idea of the kind of stories that you are going to hear throughout, that kind of historical narrative, narrative nonfiction or narrative literary nonfiction. Does that sound good to you?
That sounds ideal. Are you kidding?
Okay.
You're going to go on book tour with me. Okay. You're going to be introducing me. Hey, here's what he's doing. No, that's exactly it. And though Hudson is a character in my book, as I mentioned, I can't tell any of these stories at great length. So you find specific things in their stories to develop these larger themes. So with Hudson, right? So Hudson, I wrote Hudson. A book that I timed to go along with the 400th anniversary of Henry Hudson going to New York. Because in New York in 2009, Henry Hudson was a big deal.
That was your why now.
That was my why now and my where now, because it turns out Henry Hudson was not a big deal everywhere in the world, but he was a big deal in New York in 2009, which was great. It led to various invitations because people were interested in Henry Hudson, and it was Henry Hudson who got me onto the Daily Show with Jon Stewart to talk about Henry Hudson because it was the 400th anniversary.
What's that guy like?
He's fantastic.
Yeah, he seems really
he's
cool.
amazing.
I do like that person.
That's a whole separate story.
Yeah.
But so it's very rare if you spend your life like I do, your thinking life, thinking about the 16th and 17th century, to have a lot of people interested in what you're talking about. This is not common. I mean, we're about to go into next year, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Everyone knows the Declaration of Independence. There are going to be a ton of books about the Declaration of Independence coming out, and that people get it. This earlier stuff, people they just don't know about it. I once wrote a piece called Why a Fourth Grader Knows More About Henry Hudson Than You Do. Because Henry Hudson is a feature of elementary textbooks, and then he basically disappears. He's just not that interesting, but he is really interesting. The going to New York part to me is not that interesting, but let me take a step back. I don't know anything about early Henry Hudson.
Why don't people know more about early Henry Hudson? Because it's not that you don't, it's that nobody does.
So it's a fascinating question, Hayden, because there's more water on planet Earth named for Henry Hudson than anybody else.
Really?
The bay, the strait, and the river.
Okay.
You'd think this guy would just be everywhere, but he's not, because who knows why pedagogical, intellectual trends are the way they are. People interested in exploring know about him. They really know about his third voyage. That's when he goes up the Hudson River.
Okay.
People pay less attention to what came before or what came after. What came after is what my book is about, his last journey. But in some sense, I think in our national discussion, people focus on certain early things get a lot of attention.
No, I'm talking about specifically like nobody knows about this dude, what he was doing prior to like the shit that he did that we do know about. Like the Henry Hudson, from like his birth to his career, is just like unknowable.
Henry Hudson, from his birth to about age 40, which is where I think he is when he enters the historical record.
40?
40. That's my guess.
In what year was
1607.
Yes, in 1607.
So Henry Hudson's born sometime in the latter decades of the 16th century.
That's like nobody knowing about Neil Young until like this part of his career, like equivalently, right? Because he's
but remember,
40 years old then.
But this is 400 years ago. I mean, we don't know much about the vast majority of people who walked the planet 400 years ago.
Okay, fair enough. Fair point.
And he has a rather, thank you, sad end, which helps actually him keep his name alive because things are named after him, like especially the bay and the river. I mean, so that's because he doesn't make it back. But it's hard to explain why people don't study him. He's useful for elementary school kids because in that old story that Americans used to tell, it was about the Europeans' discovery of America, right? We still use this phrase. I would say it's about an era of mutual discoveries. Native peoples are as much players in this as Europeans. As one of the anecdotes I tell in this story, Henry Hudson's life would be very different if he had better relations with a couple of native peoples at certain key moments in his life. But he fits in that old story of Europeans coming over, and you can tell his story, especially his 1609 journey, in a fairly straightforward way. So basically, Henry Hudson wants to get spices from the Southwest Pacific. He's looking for a water route to get there. He looks at the maps that circulate at the end of the 16th century, which have on them the so-called Northwest Passage and the Northeast Passage.
Do we know how many people the Northwest Passage actually just totally fucked up? Because I feel like if you're an explorer...
Well, that's very good.
Isn't that awesome?
It's really good.
There is like a 90% chance that you're going to get fucked up in the Northwest Passage. It just seems like in this era of exploration, as soon as somebody's like, they were looking for the Northwest Passage, I go, I bet you I know what happened next.
Yeah. They died looking or they came back not finding it. Yeah. Those are the two scenarios. But they came back. Those things happened, but they came back and sometimes still got famous. I mean, Sir Francis Drake, who the English celebrity for going around the world, isn't trying to go around the world. He's trying to find the Northwest Passage, but from the other side. So he goes around South America. There's various troubles on his ship. And
he's taking the proto-Cook route.
Yeah, basically. And he goes up the West Coast looking for what he thinks is the opening to the Northwest Passage from what we would think of as the Pacific side. But in the meantime, he does various things. He's super famous now. He's super famous because he realizes he can't find the passage, so he decides to go home the other way. And he survives. So he's the second European. He leads the second European expedition to make it around the world. Magellan led the first, but Magellan is murdered during his, so he doesn't make it home. Drake makes it home. He's a big hero. Henry Hudson knows this, right? Everybody in England knows that Drake is a big hero, feted everywhere. Everyone knows that whoever can find the Northwest Passage, which is on their maps, they're looking at it, that person is going to become rich. The queen or the king, depending on when you are, is going to make a hero out of you as Elizabeth I, maid of Drake. And you are going to do all sorts of things that we don't think much about today. Like you're going to help Protestantism spread across the world. You're going to lead to a revolution in medical treatments because you're going to get these spices when they're fresher and better for human health. You're going to do, the list of things. Henry Hudson knows all of this. All these explorers do this, as do their financial backers. And so the reason I surmised that Henry Hudson's about 40, and it's a guess, is that somebody is entrusting him with a ship, a huge investment, and a bunch of guys, it's all men, and a couple of teenage boys, one of whom is his son, sign up to go on it. Now, people could say, well, they sign up because they need work. It's just true. But no one signs up on a voyage that they think they're not going to survive. You have to have some faith in the captain that you're going to come home again. And the investor has to have some faith that you're going to bring that ship home, because the ship is the investment. Labor is much less than the ship, but the ship is important. So Henry Hudson had some experience, I think, sort of sailing along the basically the eastern edges of England, learning how to sort of navigate rocky areas, shallow waters, something, and then some experience with how we get along with people. The people said, okay, we're going to invest in you.
Back in the day, because this is actually something I've never thought about. I'd be interested to know if you thought about this at all, because it seems like something like you ought to think about. But how much was one of those ships like worth? Like when you say like that's like the investment, and it sounds dumb, but I've just like never considered that before. I was just like, oh yeah, well they had the ships, and then there was expensive cargo, and they were doing this stuff. I always kind of felt like it was a lease or something. How did
I'm sure there is some value that it had on some value in pounds that it had on it, which I'm not going to know.
I mean, would it be like me buying, like, we're like renting a private jet to like be like, I'm going to try to find a new way to Kansas?
Yeah, but imagine you're renting a private jet when there are only 5 private jets instead of 100 private jets.
Okay, so it's more like me renting a spaceship.
This is a real investment to build these ships. Like these ships take months to build. The wood has to cure. You need the right people to do it. You need the right people to make the ropes, the right people to make the sails, the anchor. You need to find a mathematician to come and navigate from the stars. You need to study all these charts. You need to know how to use a compass, an astrolabe, you know, how you sort of measure where you are. They can't judge longitude because you need a marine clock to judge longitude. So they don't know how far west they're going, right? So you need to gather all this. The equivalent, it's not quite the investment of shooting a rocket into space, but it's closer to that than renting a private jet. So putting aside the chronometer, which does not exist for Henry Hudson.
Okay.
So Henry Hudson in 1607 decides he's going to look for the Northwest Passage. And 1607 is famous in American history because that's the year of Jamestown, when the English go and they try. And part of what I write about in Contested Continent is that those seem to us beginnings of stories. 1607, the beginning of the American experience. This is deep into the American experience. The American experience, which I think of as the meeting of peoples across the Atlantic Basin and peoples of Europe meeting Native Americans, starts earlier. And even English colonization starts earlier, but the English keep failing. They keep going. They cross the Atlantic Ocean. They go to places and they keep failing. They fail constantly. But we edit those out of our textbooks. We edit those out of our national myth because those stories aren't interesting. I mean, did you know that the English wanted to colonize the Amazon or the Orinoco Basin? You know, we don't talk about these things. We don't talk about the fact that the English thought Newfoundland, which would eventually become a colony in the 1580s, was this great thing. We don't talk about it because 2 of the 3 ships went down on the way home, and the others thought this is not a good investment to make. The year of 1607, Jamestown, is right when a group of English colonists are giving up on colonizing the coast of Maine. Why do they give up? It's too damn cold. Because this is the era of the Little Ice Age, and things are super cold. And the English are failing all over the place. But in 1607, they go to Jamestown. And for reasons that we can talk about, they survive. Hudson goes that year. Right? Hudson goes, and he's going to go find the Northwest Passage. And if you look at a map, you look at any map now, the obvious, easiest way, most direct way from England to the Southwest Pacific is to go over the North Pole. And the prevailing geographical theory was that the North Pole melted in the summertime. And so if you go up to it during this period when it's melted and you get into it, you can go all the way across and come down the other side to what they call the South Sea, what we call the Pacific Ocean. Trick, of course, would be getting through that open polar sea while there's still water there, not frozen, because if it's frozen, you're going to die. Well, Henry Hudson in 1607 says, I'm going that way. He goes north. He doesn't make it. He runs into icebergs, whatever, and he turns around and he says, I don't think that way is going to work. So then he thinks, okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to try going to the Northwest Passage. So he's going to sail across the Atlantic Ocean, and that doesn't go very well at first. And then he decides he's going to go on the Northeast Passage, north of Russia. So he and his crew are going to go there. They run into ice. They come back. That's 1609. 1610. You have to give to Henry Hudson. He is a stubborn man.
He's trying.
He is trying. But the amazing thing is those three, and on 1609, I should have said, after they try to go to the Northeast, they sail west, and that's when he goes to what is now New York in 1609. And his route is amazing. They give up the Northeast, like going north of Scandinavia into the Northeast Passage because he can't find it because it's all frozen.
Mm-hmm.
He goes back. They sail across. Now, by this time, Jamestown's a couple of years old. And Henry Hudson, back in England, between his voyages, is talking to people. So one of the things he knows is that Jamestown is not the north. Going up the Chesapeake Bay is not the way to the Pacific Ocean.
Mm-hmm.
So they coasted, and they keep going up, and they get to the mouth of what is now the Hudson. Big. The mouth Hudson's huge. And he thinks, this must be it.
This is kind of like Cook looking for, like in the Cook Inlets and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
It's like kind of like they keep poking into these like various bays. I mean,
Because how are you supposed to know which one works? Right? So Henry Hudson, they go, the ship goes up the Hudson, and it meets what is now called the Mohawk River,
mm-hmm.
And then it becomes very small. And Henry Hudson says, this is not the Northwest Passage. So he decides to come back in. During this expedition of 1609, Henry Hudson has some bad relations with some native peoples that he meets, and a couple of his guys get killed, and they kill some native peoples around what is now New York.
What's the nature of the bad relation? Is there?
Well, they just have miscommunication because they can't talk to each other, and they're probably trying to trade with each other, and they invite people on board, and it goes badly, and there's a huge amount of mistrust and ill will. And at this point, English people and other Europeans have become very suspicious about native peoples because of stories of violence that had happened before, some very famous stories that had happened before. And so the English kind of have a hair trigger response to basically misunderstandings. And so some people, I don't mean to make light of this, some native peoples and a couple of Henry Hudson sailors get killed. Now, the reason that's significant is it puts into a sharp relief these first two expeditions, everybody lived. Everybody came home. He didn't find the Northwest or the Northeast Passage, but everybody lived. So if you're and the ship came home, ships came home every time. So if you're an investor, you're thinking, he's a good bet.
Mm.
He is unlucky, but he is skilled. And he's skilled, among other things, keeping his men in line, right? They all come back. So 1610, he decides he's going to try again.
What are his I understand the sentiment among the investors. What's the assessment among the employees? Like, what do they feel about him? Are they like, he is a great, you hear a lot of these people of the era being kind of lauded by their men as like, yo, this is our quarterback. This is the guy. This dude's the man. He knows what he's doing. Did he have a similar sentiment? Was it documented in any
So
sort
through
of way?
1609, when these expeditions fail, but there are reports taken and people there, you get the sense of general respect for Hudson. And in fact, the guy who is his first mate named Robert Jewett goes back with him in 1610. And he has other people who seem to go with him. His reputation is intact. It'll change on the next expedition. But at that point, he seems to have the trust of his people. And no doubt, even people who are, a lot of these guys who signed up for work on these ships, they're typically fishing ships that they're signing up on, and they're hanging around the docks and they do a job and they make it home and then they wait and they get another. It's dangerous work. It is low paid work, but no one, I would suggest, is doing it if they think they're going to die, right? Like no wage is worth that. So around the docks, Hudson's reputation must be, you can trust this guy. Look, these other ships came home and the crews came home.
What about are there any like personal anecdotes, about him? Is there anything like, I can't help it, but I keep referencing stuff from Hampton Sides' thing, and so when there are these things like, James Gordon Bennett, pissing in the piano or whatever, right? Not that he was a captain, but I guess in the context we're talking about, he was a leader of men. Bizarrely in retrospect. Are there any like Does he have? Is there anything about the mother of his son?
Okay. So what I know,
Yeah.
And I looked, and maybe there's more out there. Certainly, he's married, and certainly his wife trusts him to take their teenage son with them, and that boy goes with him on all 4 voyages, right? So, he and his father had to get a very tight bond. We know that before one of his voyages, and probably before all of them, Hudson goes off to church and takes a bunch of the crew, and they pray and they ask for good wishes. And, you can infer from that, okay, he's like an establishment kind of a guy who does sort of take seriously this idea of what the English in the early 17th century would think about spreading the Protestant faith. But you can't tell much else until the last voyage, and then you learn a lot about him as a person. But up until that voyage, no.
Why are these? You say you learn a lot about Henry Hudson during the course of this expedition. Why? How do you mean?
So Henry Hudson, not to spoil the plot.
Yeah, big themes here. We need a cliffhanger.
All right. Well, I won't spoil the plot then.
Okay.
The 4th expedition, which becomes decisive in many ways, produces a lot of testimony. And in that testimony, people are talking about Henry Hudson's character.
Why is there a testimony? Is there an investigation into what the hell went wrong?
Without spoiling the plot?
Oh, okay. No,
tell me where to go.
No. Now I understand. You know what? Why don't you just tell me about it, man? Let's learn together.
Okay. So in the testimony that survives from that last expedition, we learn a lot about Henry Hudson.
Okay.
The expedition starts off okay. They decide they're going to still go to the Northwest Passage, and they're going to go to a more northerly route.
So they're playing the hits. They're just coming back.
But they're looking for a new way in.
Okay.
Because the trick is to find the opening, because their maps are telling them it's there. So they go up, and he sails into what is now called Hudson Strait. Other explorers, European explorers, had been in it, but they'd never gone very far.
Can I interrupt you one more time? I'm sorry.
Please.
And there are going to be a lot of comments on this that are like, "Did you guys interrupted him?" I know. Sorry. You do the interview. Before we get why, I know why there's the obsession with the Northwest Passage. Why aren't people just more critical of their maps at this point? What is going on that through I guess eventually they do find it, right? But why through this time, all the way into USS Jeanette land?
So I think whenever someone is exploring an area that they don't know about, right? Mm-hmm. And we have to put that into context. When I say the English don't know much about what's in Hudson Strait, they're Inuit peoples around there who know that area intimately, right? They're not the first humans to go there, but they're the first Europeans, or some of the first Europeans to go there. They need something. They are looking at the best experts of the time, right? I mean, you're not going to get in a rocket and go into space unless you were convinced that the smartest person on Earth did the heat shield for when you come home, right? Mm-hmm. You have to have some faith that the people behind this have your best interests at heart and their best interests.
But a lot of these people are just random ass cartographers.
No. They're not random. No, these people are sort of, they have royal patrons. These are scholars. There's a whole industry to it. They're constantly want to say, well, my map is newer than your map. Maps are printed then in black and white. There's a whole cottage industry of people that hand colored the maps, and these go on the walls of rich people. I mean, this is a big deal enterprise. And knowing how geography works, knowing how currents work, where land masses are, who lives there, what do they speak, is the key to a lot of wealth. And the proof of that is that the Dutch have done that, and other Europeans have done that. The Portuguese, the Spaniards have generated a lot of wealth before Henry Hudson goes sailing.
How do people arrive at this, the predominant theory of the time, the open
polar sea?
Yeah, the open polar sea.
Because the open polar sea makes sense to them because their way of thinking is it's warmer in the summertime because the sun is shining longer and maybe the sun is closer. And so therefore, just like if you had an ice cube and you were living in London and you put the ice cube out in January, you could come back a month later, it's going to be there. If you put it out in July, you come back in 10 minutes, it's not there. I mean, it's kind of basic observational science, but shrouded in geographic theory, shrouded in people who say, this is real, even though none of them know it. Right? It has to be real because that's what their theory tells them. They don't know there's this thing that we now call the Little Ice Age going on. They're not wrong. Those map makers about the Northwest and Northeast Passage, they're not wrong. They were early. Right? Climate change has revealed those passages. So they were dead on right. How they were right is an interesting question that I guess we're never quite going to know.
I guess I'm less talking about that and more talking about them trying to come over the top. I guess that's sort of what I meant.
Well, coming over the top. So these maps have details on them that are known, and then they have details on them that are speculative, right? And so take the Northwest Passage. Okay? So if you believe that there is a water route that's going to go through North America, you don't know where it is, but it's water route. You're going to say to yourself, on the eastern side of that, the Atlantic is going to push in, right? The currents are going to go in a certain way. And then at a certain point, you're going to find that the water is going in a different direction. That must be the influence of the South Sea, whether it's draining towards them or pushing, the water is going to change. These guys in their journals spend a huge amount of time staring at water, like literally staring at water. They're staring at water in part to figure out how deep it is, because they can't always tell from the soundings how deep it is. But they're staring at water because the water holds all sorts of clues, including about currents. A lot of expeditions in the Atlantic and the Pacific, probably more in the Pacific, fail because people simply don't know how the currents and the winds work. They go the wrong time of year. They get caught in the doldrums. They get caught and they're out there and they run out of fresh water and they die. This was fairly common. These seas are, we forget, we live in an age of flying. They don't, right? They live in an age where there are people who are looking at the stars and making estimates about the size of the world correctly, but they don't know how to measure longitude. They don't know where on the sea they are. They don't know where exactly the West Indies were. Where's Hispaniola? Columbus gets to Hispaniola. Where is that? That's a guess. Now there are maps, right? Because by the time of Columbus, there are maps of various areas. What there isn't is an accurate way to tell where the passage is. So Columbus is sailing 100 years plus after Columbus. So there's been a lot of explorations. There have been English people as well as other Europeans who've gone into the interior of what we think of as Canada. Frobisher makes 3 journeys there in the 1570s. He starts off thinking he's going to find the Northwest Passage. He instead finds a bunch of ore with gold flecks in it. He's convinced he's found gold. And then all of a sudden he decides he's going to set up a gold mining colony. Well, that turns out to be a failure, but it took 3 trips and 200 tons of ore coming back before the assayer the first time said yes. And the assayers, when it finally came back, said no, good try. And so they give up. So within 3 years, you have someone like Frobisher who thought he was going for the passage. His entire purpose shifts, and then he's a failure, right? So he's a failure because he didn't find the passage. He's a failure because he didn't set up the gold mine. But he's not a failure. He brought back a lot of information. So, I talk about all of the narratives that survive from this age of discovery or mutual discovery. All of them add to the stock of knowledge, and that is very important. So even something disappointing, Hudson's first 3 trips, nonetheless produce, hey, here's a landscape where we could have a colony someday. Here's some people who are friendly to us. Here's an incredible supply of cod. Cod's like a big business in this period.
Yeah, it's like I didn't find any morel mushrooms, but I did find a really great berry patch.
Yes, same idea, right? So he brings back this knowledge, and he brings back, sometimes if you say to someone, this isn't the way, you've saved that person a lot of effort because they say, okay, go a different way. So in 1610, Hudson goes that different way through Hudson Strait into the bay. And when he enters Hudson, what's now called Hudson Bay, I'm sure he thought, we made it. We're in an ocean, right? It's so big. How could this not be the South Sea? And so then they keep sailing and they make it to the western shores of the bay, and they're poking around thinking, how do we get through? Why are we not getting through? And then at some point during this expedition, some of the men become infirm. They have an injury. They become sick. They become less useful. And one of the clues to Hudson's personality, as this later testimony reveals, is that Hudson decided to feed everyone. In other words, there are people on the ship who are like, those guys are useless. Let's get rid of them, according to some of the testimony. And Hudson's like, no, everybody eats. Everybody eats equally.
They wanted to starve those guys?
No, I think they wanted to throw them overboard.
Oh my gosh.
But again, this is a story they tell after the fact. I don't want to leave a little suspense here, but I mean, there's reasons they tell the story in this way.
Sure.
But we do learn something about his character. If this is true, we learn something about his character. And we also learn, according to the testimony, that as they're poking the western shores of Hudson Bay, the summer is going on. He always leaves in April. Now the summer's going on, and they know that winter is coming. And they know that the place they came from is going to freeze, or they think it's going to freeze. So they decide, what do we do? We're not finding it this sailing season. We could still go home. Everybody lives, make it home. Or we say we're going to overwinter and we sail south, because by their geographical theory, the farther south you go, the warmer it should be. It's not entirely wrong. In their case, turned out to be wrong, but it's not entirely wrong in theory. So they have an onboard debate. That tells us something about Hudson, that he's not just kind of an arrogant prick who's pushing his way onto things, that he seems to engage in discussion. Now, it is true that there are unhappy men on this ship, and there's only one ship. So it's not like the ones who want to go home can go home and the others can go on. Mm-hmm. They're all in it one way or another. And so after this debate, they decide they're going to stay on, and they sail south, and they sail south out of what is now Hudson Bay into what is now James Bay. And then they hit, as far as anyone can tell, basically they can't get any farther south. They get stuck. And at this point, winter is coming on.
They just get iced in.
They're going to get iced in. So they're trying to figure out, where do we go? Where do we go where the ship, when it's iced in, will be intact next year when it thaws, right? Because if they went where it's too rocky and ripped the hull open, there's no way they're repairing that hull, right? So they're reading the water. They're trying to figure out, and they go towards one side of the bay, which seems to be more predictable to them. And they get within sight of the shore, and they decide to going to drop anchor there. And then, as far as I've been able to understand, they take off a bunch of the supplies. Everyone goes on land. They punch a couple of holes in the hull, knowing that the water's going to get in, but that way it equalizes, and so the pressure won't crush the hull, but the hull will survive. And they seem to have done that. We know it worked because the ship makes it back to England. So that was a good calculation. They go on to the shore, and then this winter sets in. And the winter is long and brutal, and the ship is encased in ice from November to June. During this time, these guys are trying to survive. And the unlucky ones are the ones who have to go out to the ship to get something that was left behind. Because later explorers in this area would talk about how your skin freezes and your eyes would freeze and everything because it's so bitterly cold. The narratives of James Bay from the 1630s, this is a great notion. Those narratives were used by Robert Boyle, the English experimental scientist, to determine what cold is. He used their journeys, their journals from their ship to decide this is cold, defined the concept of cold through these journals.
He's the Oxford guy, the Boyle's Law guy, right?
Bingo. Yeah. So that's amazing. Like, that's a contribution knowledge which, you don't see coming from people leaving logs on their ship.
Wait, sorry, one more thing. Was he one of the dudes that, have you ever heard about, there was a lady who was hung for infanticide, but she wasn't really, like, was he like a physician guy, or was he just a chemist?
I only know him as a natural philosopher, sort of scientist, so I don't know this
I think
story.
you can look this up, but like basically they tried to kill this lady, didn't work. They get her body to, they think she's dead. They put her body in a coffin, bring her to where all these dudes are like making leaps and bounds studying anatomy because they're going to dissect her. They open the coffin, she has a pulse. I think Boyle and a dude named Williams. Look up boil, hung lady, divine intervention. It'll come up. They basically take it. They nurse her back to health, like putting her in bed with somebody who like snuggles up and warms her up and giving her hot compresses and stuff. And in like 2 weeks, she's better. And they don't try her again because they're like, well, obviously God wants this one alive.
I don't know. It's a great story. I hope it's him.
Anne Green was the lady in question. In December 1650, this 22-year-old maidservant in Oxford, England, was hanged for infanticide after concealing a stillborn child. Her body was taken for dissection by a group of early scientists, but she revived, likely due to hypothermia and a weak pulse, prompting widespread views of its divine intervention. She was pardoned, married, and had 3 children, and lived until 1659. Robert Boyle, a key figure in Oxford experimental philosophy circle, including Thomas Willis and William Petty, was involved. His group had gathered to dissect her, only to find her alive instead.
We're bringing the bonus points back.
Well played. Turns out that James Bay is an incredibly cold place. And Hudson's men are there, and this winter is really long. And at one point during the winter, Hudson goes off apparently by himself. They're kind of foraging for whatever they can find during the winter. And the snow is really deep, and they could fall into a snowbank and never be seen again. But Hudson goes plodding off one day. And remember, they're not equipped like modern-day mountaineers. These guys are equipped wearing these thick woolens that you would wear at sea, right? He's not ready to go through snowdrifts, which are 10, 20 feet tall, right? But somehow he manages to find a way. And he goes out, and one day he seems to meet a native man who, from where it takes place, I think was a Cree. And they sort of exchange signs because they can't talk to each other, and they sort of trade. And Hudson gives him whatever something, and this man gives him something. And Hudson thinks, okay, this guy's going to help us, right? And so he goes back and he tells people, oh my God, I met this guy. Then Hudson goes back. The guy doesn't show up again. So whatever Henry Hudson had done didn't please this man. Had he, this whole voyage might have had a different ending, right? We don't know. It's one of these many things that we're never going to know about what happened. So basically, they survive the winter. Only one guy dies during the winter, which is a miracle given how cold it is. And then the thaw comes. It comes in June of 1611. The Discovery is finally free from the ice. They patch it up and they start sailing. At this point, though they'd had some debate apparently about should we look for the passage, at this point it seems like the men are fed up and like, we're going home because we know we can get home. We just follow the eastern shore of James Bay, eastern shore of Hudson Bay through the strait, and we'll get home. Okay? Because we came that way. So they know that that can work. What we don't know is that during the winter, some of these men became enraged with Hudson, including about the fact that Hudson was sharing food with everybody equally. Then they tell stories that, in fact, Hudson was hiding food on the ship for only himself and his son and a couple of good friends. So they break into his chest and they rob him. They say, see, we found these things that Henry Hudson didn't share with us. And they decide they're going to mutiny against him.
But he was hiding stuff?
Well, according to the testimony, they don't find much food or anything. And although it would have been preserved, I mean, it's cold there it was basically an ice chest for months. But no, but apparently some people thought he was squirreling things away. It's unclear because we don't have an inventory of what they found, right? But this feeds the rumor mill that Henry Hudson is out for himself, not out for all of us.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but is like their sentiment more or less like, yeah, number one, this guy is like kind of using a bunch of these sickly crewmates and what seems to be goodwill towards them as a cover to like be like, oh, I wouldn't do that. I do this. So like the fact that he's squirreling stuff away, he's kind of trying to smooth it over. Is that the?
So I think that's exactly what some of them thought.
Okay.
But the reason I say I think is because on the way back, so they have a mutiny.
Yeah.
They described in the later testimony. They take Hudson from his cabin, they tie his hands behind his back, and they lower him into a little exploratory rowboat called a shallop. And they put his 17-year-old son, I think his son is 17.
I would like to hear more about this mutiny, please.
Okay. So, in mid-June of 1611, the ship is finally free to go. And these guys who had apparently been plotting all winter decide this is our moment. We're going to get rid of Henry Hudson now because Henry Hudson is going to try to make us go to look for the passage again. And we don't trust him. And then there's all this, he's hiding stuff from us. He has favorites. He's not a good guy. He's going to kill us. That's basically the shorthand. He's going to make us stay here. We were lucky to survive one winter. There's no chance we're surviving 2 winters. And they just give up. They don't think they're going to find the passage. They were right. They weren't going to find the passage, right? So in some sense, props to them. But so they decide they've had it and they have to go home. And one of the guys who's the head of this mutiny was Hudson's first mate on the 1609 expedition. He was like Hudson's closest sailing companion, this guy, Robert Jewett. But during the winter, somehow during the journey, Hudson demoted him because they had a fight about something. So he's personally angry with Hudson. Jewett is. So he, with a bunch of these other sort of plotters, they're sort of stealing away because even though the ship is not free till mid-June, by late spring, they're able to move around. Their Arctic grasses are coming up. I'm sure they're fishing. They have much more mobility, but they just can't move the ship until the ice is really gone, and they're just wedged in. And so they just plot according to the surviving testimony. And so one morning they wake up, they decide to surprise Hudson, and these ships are built so the captain has his own quarters, and they break in, and they grab him and they tie him up and they figure, well, his son's going to be on his side. So they put the son in the shallop and then they say, who else are Henry Hudson's friends? And a couple of these guys were sick. They put them on the shallop. They put about 7 guys on there. And the guys are put on the shallop and they sort of say, what are you doing? You're leaving us behind. They're like, yeah, we're leaving you behind. Then they have a debate about the ship's carpenter who ends up staying with Henry Hudson because he wants his tools to help build he probably built whatever lodging they were in for that winter. So they let him have some tools and then they leave. And in this really vivid moment in the testimony, the shallop is lowered into the water and they cut the rope. And then it says they flew as if from an enemy, right? They are just leaving these guys in this rowboat, waving forlornly, don't do this to us. And they catch the breeze and they are gone. And this moment of that gets memorialized in 19th century history paintings. So you can go to England and see like Henry Hudson, this terrible moment because we don't have any pictures, any paintings of Hudson. So Hudson and his teenage son, the others, disappear from the historical record at that point. Right? They are left behind. But the ship is with the mutineers is going north. It's sailing up the East Coast. They have spent the winter confined. They don't have much in the way of resources, and they see a bunch of people on the shore, Inuit, from where they are, I think, waving to them. And they think, okay, we'll trade with these guys. They will help us get out of here. They will have something, they'll have meat. They'll have something. They'll be able to get us out of here. Mm-hmm. And so a few of them, not all of them, take another shallop. There seem to be 2 on the ship. And they paddle to the shore. And they had misunderstood the signs because according to the surviving testimony, the Inuit attack them. And they deal mortal blows to them. Crucially, in the testimony, they don't die on the land. They make it back to the boat where they die. This comes up again later.
Okay.
Where they die. 4 of them die, right? Then they're sailing through the strait. And this guy Jewett, the former first mate, who was a mutineer, he basically starves to death. So now they get back. Now the crew, which started off, 23 or 24, is down to 7 or 8. It's a great sort of lesson. How many people does it take to run one of these sailing ships? Yeah. It turns out not very many. And they make it to the coast of Ireland. And they basically trade whatever they have on the ship to people, basically say, take us to London. And so the ship goes back and up the Thames and it makes it to London. And as soon as it lands, people show up and they go, where's Hudson? What happened? And by the way, there's blood all over the decks of the ship. And, it is quite possible that was Henry Hudson's blood, but we don't know because the narrative that survives when they start to tell their story says basically, oh yeah, these Inuit guys mortally wounded our guys and it's their blood on the ship. Now there's no CSI in the 17th century. Who knows whose blood is, but it does prove the ship gets back and that something violent happened on it or people presumably died on it. So the first people that interrogate them are people whose job is to police navigation along the Thames. And these are like professional matters. They're called the Masters of Trinity House. And sorry, they're called the Masters of Trinity House. And you can see that they want to know what happened, but the testament that survives is also like, by the way, did you find the Northwest Passage? And you answer these questions, they're really interested in what can you tell us?
Right. And
so these guys basically sort of fill in some information, and then still nobody knows exactly what happened. So then other people, King decides, others decide they should go explore. So they send multiple expeditions into this area, into Hudson's Bay in the 16 teens. This is where Bath then becomes very famous. And they can find no sign of Henry Hudson, and they can't find the passage either. And they conclude the passage doesn't exist, or if it does exist, this isn't the way into it. And so they come back, and then the English have a real problem. It's sort of like, okay, we can't find Hudson, but something happened. So what do we do? And they say, we're going to put the survivors on trial for murder. Because mutiny is actually not a crime at the moment.
I was just going to ask.
Yeah, mutiny is not a crime in the English law until later in the 17th century. So they're put on trial for murder for exposing Henry Hudson to his death. So they don't have a body. They don't know how he died, but they're sure that he killed him. This is where the testimony basically, where the survivors say, these terrible things happened, but all the mutineers are those guys who died. None of us had anything to do with it.
These four dudes, man. It's
those guys did it,
Inuits
not
took
us.
them out.
And it's one of these sort of weird things that happens every time, sometimes in the archives. The documents are damaged. So we don't have the full trial record. But what we know is when they go forward and they're on trial, the other people are on trial too, and they're on trial for piracy. And the English are obsessed with piracy. And some of the testimony in the court, and this is the High Court of Admiralty, some of the testimony is, were the mutineers going to become pirates? Like they really want to know the motivation of the mutineers. And they're basically saying, no, we don't know, yada, yada, yada. And they don't know. And the result at the end is other people tried in the same session. They're hanged as pirates. No one from the Hudson expedition. So if any of these guys actually participated in the murder, they got off with it. So then that's where the documents take you. But then everyone wants to know, well, what happened to Hudson? Like what really happened? I mean, I've left in my book, I kind of leave the reader hanging for a while because he's on the ship and they leave him behind. And so this is where, historians do this all the time. We go into the evidence, we try to reconstruct, what we think happened. And I reconstruct at the end of my book what I think happened to Hudson. But certain is too strong a word, because for all I know, they murdered him and that's his blood on the decks, right? So I'm never going to know. But if I take the narrative as accurate, and other parts of the narrative do check out, some of the later expeditions find little signs, little archaeological remains. One expedition in the 1630s finds these stakes that had been put in the ground, like something you would tie a rowboat to. And it's not something that Inuit or Cree would have done because they are on these very light kayaks that they would have pulled up on the shore. So was that a sign that Europeans were there? Were these chopped by an axe? Was it the carpenter's axe that did this? Skip ahead to 1670 and other expeditions there. They find what they say are the remains of an English house. And they surmise this is where Hudson died. So I do have some external evidence to suggest that Hudson did survive this mutiny, does go on land, and then it becomes, what do you think happened? And I think this is the middle of the little ice age. It's the peak, the little ice age is starting to get slightly warmer then, but not much warmer yet. And I think basically they probably built some shelter, and they probably died one after another. And then during the course of that winter, I think they dragged the bodies out into these deep piles of snow, and I think that ravaging bears probably ate them. I mean, I don't know in a certain sense, but the story, in the end, what does this all mean? It needs me as historian, and this is where historians come into it, to say, look, anyone can go into an archive and read the documents. I don't have some special skill, but what I bring to this story is I just spent a lot of time with these documents, reading a lot of things around these documents to make what I hope are informed guesses about what happened. It's sort of like, a much better documented, but still, why the Hawaiians kill Cook, right? I mean, we could be debating that till the end of time, right? Everyone says, oh, we know this or know that, but there's a certain point where the evidence just stops. And this is what historians wrestle with all the time. I want to know more. I want to know what that guy who left no records had to say. And it's just, we historians, talk about this thing, and it's just, you run into the wall. So you fast forward, and on some level, the story I told you is Henry Hudson didn't find the Northwest Passage, but Henry Hudson did make it to New York. And that's a nice story. So let's put that for kids to know. I mean, there are a bunch I've consulted on kids' books, have nothing to do with 1610, 1611.
You probably don't put the blood on the ship decks in the cover of those books, do you?
Say that again?
You probably don't put all the blood on the ship deck.
No, those stories are only 1609. All right, they don't even get to the mutiny because that doesn't matter because Henry Hudson disappears from our national story. Except for his name.
Myself, and I would think a lot of others. I grew up by, the Hudson River, I mean, not by it, but like in proximity. I always imagined Henry Hudson was it was like one of those things you just like have a blind spot to. I don't know. It would be like Andrew, who's born and raised in Bozeman. It's like, do you know a shit ton about Lewis and Clark? Yeah, well, it's like kind of one of those things that it's like in such proximity that you just kind of don't think about it very much.
That's exactly right.
And I always just figured that Hudson was like, I don't know, maybe some dude from New York who like went up this river, like, I mean, obviously before, New York was New York, and like mapped some shit or founded some things or, it's bizarre to me how unbelievably like wrong I was and how that wrongness is like shared with a lot of people or by a lot of people.
I don't think it's wrongness.
I share my wrongness with a bunch of people every week.
But I think it's because of the way we tell our national stories. Some people have a use value. Henry Hudson's use value in our national myth is to go to New York, right? And then that's why the Hudson River, right? He's useful for that. If you are Canadian or, you like certain blankets, he's useful for knowing, oh, that's who the Hudson Bay is named after. And the Hudson Bay Company is this amazing company, right? He's useful, right? But besides that, he's not as compelling a figure. He gets a little more complicated in the American story because that 1609 voyage is paid for by the Dutch, and it's one of the reasons the Dutch claim what will become New Amsterdam, New Netherlands, which the English and the Dutch would then fight over later in the 17th century. So he's a little complicated in that sense, but that's too nuanced in some sense it's for our historical narrative. Go ahead.
It's kind of like so stupid. I watched this documentary about Barry Sanders the other day, and it was like I always knew that like Barry Sanders was an amazing football player, running back. I think. Can you?
Yeah, he was a running back.
Okay, good. I was like, because I will get crucified if that's wrong.
Well, I mean, you better check that because it's been years. But I remember watching Barry Sanders play.
I mean, it was like this amazing. He did amazing stuff, and then all of a sudden he was just gone. And while it was common knowledge that he kind of just up and quit, there wasn't a lot of like why or how, and that wasn't even explored very much up until like recently. It kind of seems that way too. It's like Henry Hudson had a lot of these big hits, and it was like, yeah, there was some stuff that, you know, you don't need to worry about that. But let's just like play the hits again, you know?
Well, but if I was to ask you, what do you think about Christopher Columbus, right? So Christopher Columbus, for a long, long time, was a hero in the way that Europeans and Americans wrote their histories. He was a hero until 1992. And in 1992, on the 500th anniversary of his first expedition, as one person said, time, he got mugged on the way to his own party. And all of a sudden, the Christopher Columbus, who everyone had revered, became one of the great villains in history. Because Christopher Columbus and is like the father of ecological despoilation. Christopher Columbus is the father of enslavement in the Americas. Christopher Columbus did all these things terrible to people. Depending on where you enter that story, and quite literally, if you grow up in the United States, what age you are, in elementary things, Christopher Columbus is a discoverer. He's an explorer who discovers things. And then as you go farther on and you get into the more recent scholarship about him, you get a very complicated Christopher Columbus. And it's not just an academic debate. There are people out there decapitating Columbus statues and pouring red paint on them to symbolize blood, right? Christopher Columbus is a lightning rod now when he wasn't for a long time. Henry Hudson is, I can't imagine ever going to have the history of Christopher Columbus because Henry Hudson never did anything documented that we know was horrific.
Do you know I'm asking this because you're from Philly. Do you know the Columbus Museum or like the Italian Heritage Museum on 9th and like around 9th and Passyunk?
I can't say that I do. Now I'm going to be crucified in some way.
During I forget what it is. Look up like 9th and Passyunk and see like if that is where that like it's like an Italian Heritage Museum. I was walking out of my then girlfriend's apartment to go get some breakfast one Columbus Day. And there were a bunch of reporters out front. There was somebody like throwing red paint all over it because...
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. So, we tell, why do we focus on some people in history and not lots of others? So Henry Hudson had his moment. He's celebrated by some as this discoverer. And then as I write in Fatal Journey, it's just a way more complicated and frankly more interesting question because among other things it tells us is that these people who we just instinctively group together either as heroes or as villains, as Europeans coming to claim parts of North America. That's a political question, heroes or villains. We often presume they're on the same side. Hudson's Voyage tells us there are huge divisions. We just don't see the fractures very frequently.
And, to build the bridge into your upcoming project, that's what Contested Continent does so well, is that it provides a lot of this nuanced context, not only in American history as we think of it, that's starting 1492, but also the things that led up to America as we know it all the way up until what it ends at mid 1680s. Is that
1680?
1680. The other thing that's really cool that it does is it makes you think about it from a continental perspective, including places like Mexico. When you think about the history of the Americas, you more or less think about you take the East Coast and you go 600 miles inland, and like that's kind of what we're thinking about most of the time.
Most of the time we think we don't get beyond the crest of the Appalachian Mountains in the way that we think about early America. We think about those 13 colonies. No, thank you. Yes, it is a continental story. I start this story with the movement of maize, corn, from Mexico to this phenomenal place that many Americans have never been called Cahokia in East St. Louis. It's not in Missouri. It's in Illinois. It's on the other side of the river, where these mounds are there. And it was the largest city north of Mexico. And it lasted for a couple of hundred years. And then there was a series of droughts and megastorms and the population dispersed. But the movement of maize, of corn, allowed for the development of larger populations. And that became foundational to a lot of native peoples long before Europeans showed up, and native populations could grow as a result of that. Because corn is a crop, among others, you can store. And once you figure out how to grow it and keep the nutrients in the ground. So there's this flourishing of this place called Cahokia. Well worth a visit.
When you say mounds, do you mean like, what the hell do they call them? Like the garbage piles where they like throw.
No.
Oh, not like
these
that?
are like, the better way to think about it would be earthen pyramids.
Oh.
With stuff buried in them, not stuff dumped in them, burials
caches?
in them.
Burials.
Like presumptively elite people surrounded
okay.
by stones and jewels that came from far away, buried in close proximity to other people's bodies which have been decapitated. People who were presumptively, we don't know for a fact, there are no documents, enslaved. So they built this hierarchical civilization of which there's this one tall mound.
Why
It's called Monk's Mound.
decapitated?
We don't know. We're asking questions about this. Archaeologists would argue that these were ritual sacrifices,
Right, yeah,
presumably
so-
timed at the death of the elite.
Right.
But at the end of the day, and there's a lot of great work, we don't know. We have archaeologists have theories about it, which are interesting. It's not what I do as a historian, but it is clear that whoever ran the show at Cahokia was able to harness the labor of many thousands of people to build these mounds. And it's clear from the archaeological evidence that they had ties to modern day Minnesota and Wisconsin, to Carolina, to Oklahoma, because we have things found in Cahokia which came from those places that are not indigenous, physical objects that are found there. And we know that there was a Cahokian artistic style, sculptural style, which is found in things in dispersed places. So this place was like the big city in North America, and climate change, 13th century climate change, got rid of it and the population dispersed, but they take maize with them. And more people became sort of sedentary agriculturalists, or at least semi-sedentary, that they would create these farms. And this is important not only because it's important for these native peoples and the way they understood the universe and their economies and how to create their societies. It's also important because they reshape, because maize agriculture, among other things, reshapes the landscape so that when Europeans do finally get to the mainland or do get to other places, they take as natural what in fact was human-made, these altered landscapes. And so it gives the Europeans a huge head start, which most of our traditional histories ignore. So I start my book with 3 basic stories, each to tell a point. One is the spread of corn, right, which is about how indigenous peoples, Europeans, hundreds of years away from coming, create these vibrant economies and create the base for these agricultural societies. 2 of these 3 stories, and they're not long stories at the beginning of my book. In the middle of the 15th century, before Columbus, Europeans by then have fallen in love with sugar. They love sugar. And the best place to grow sugar on these islands off the west coast of Africa, Madeira, the Azores, this place. By the middle of the 15th century, Portuguese, desperate to produce sugar, have begun the process of what will become the Atlantic slave trade. They are capturing people and enslaving them to produce wealth for them. That predates Columbus also. It's part of the thing. And then the third story I tell, and this is a story which is known and people think, well, whatever. The third story is of a series of explorers, most of whom have no names, who are Norse or Vikings, who go across the North Atlantic, starting a little before the year 1000. They go to Iceland, which they colonize. There are not many people there, but it's the first basically offshore colony of Europe. And then they go from Iceland, then they go to Greenland, and then they eventually make their way to Canada. That's this place called Vinland, which seems to be a seasonal fishing station. But we have archaeological evidence from Newfoundland that says they were there. We know they were there. And we know that they had established 2 settlements in Greenland, which they call the eastern and western. They're both kind of on the western shores of Greenland. One is farther north than the other. And we have archaeological evidence for them. And then we have this literature, people telling stories. So you say to yourself, all right, who cares? It's like, so some Norse people were there. And I tell the story at the beginning of the book to make a single point. Getting to North America didn't mean you were going to stay in North America or create successful colonies. Because we have this myth that following Columbus, Europeans just came over and it was all theirs. They do lay claim to it. And there's a ton of violence in my book. I mean, reader beware. There's a lot of violence in my book. But the point about the Norse is America didn't do it for everybody. Those Vikings, these are the people who create most of the cities of modern Ireland. These were raiders who knew how to succeed in other places. It wasn't worth it to them. And that strikes me as a cautionary tale. So these three sort of stories, which don't seem to have much to do with each other, maize, enslavement in these Atlantic islands, and the Norse, all sort of predate Columbus and all set up themes, which I then develop over the course of a fairly long book about why then do we have the societies that we do, right? We don't have a European society. The United States comes from the success that the English have. Why the English succeed? Well, they failed a lot of places. Why they succeed in these places? You know, why do the English in 1619 purchase a number of captive Angolans and start what we think of as slavery in what becomes the United States? Well, slavery existed before. Columbus is sent home in chains from his voyages for enslaving people in the islands. Slavery is old. Slavery is old across societies across the world. But what I try to do is to try to tell these stories in the specific context. So 1619 doesn't happen without 1607. In 1607, the founding of Jamestown is the same time as Henry Hudson. And 1607 is the time when the English are experimenting. Where are they going to go and what are they going to do? Because Jamestown, which is in every textbook, every historian, Jamestown, you'll still pick up a book about American history, 1607 to X. 1607 to me is halfway through the story that I tell in my book. The English should never have stayed in Jamestown. Jamestown was a nightmare. The English are dying. They don't know how to live there. The Powhatans who live there know what they're doing. But the English don't. Immediately, 2 years in, they have their first war. Then they have a series of other wars. But somehow they persist. What I try to do is to say, why do they persist in this place? And why in this place do they have these? Why do they purchase these enslaved peoples there? And then why does that trade develop and become much larger over the course of the 17th century? So by starting with the early pieces, I'm trying to lay the preconditions for how people think about basically how do you treat other people and how do you treat the environment? When I was growing up, I don't know if this commercial is still on TV, this commercial that for shorthand was known as the Crying Indian commercial, where a Native American man is standing by the banks of a river, and there's litter there and you see this tear. This commercial has been very famous. And it kind of embeds this myth about here people who are more in tune with nature and modern societies inherently destructive. Well, there are a lot of things about modern society which are really destructive about nature, but they didn't just happen. They came out of certain ways of thinking about how to treat it. Why do you show up at a place, claim that it's yours, following Columbus, claim that it's yours, and then just take anything that you want, right? Who gives you the right to do this? I mean, Columbus, we all talk about 1492, right? Because Columbus sails across in 1492 and he gets to the Bahamas and he goes to Hispaniola. He finds these things and he comes back. And in the spring of 1493, he writes a letter. He publishes a letter to Ferdinand and Isabella, his monarchs and patrons, describing it. He starts off this thing. This is the first European description of the Americas that we really know about because the Norse didn't leave much documentation. He starts off by saying, I sailed across the ocean, it took me X number of days, and I landed on this place which had all these people there. All these people there. I took possession of them in your name. I claimed them. I put up a sign for Ferdinand and a sign for Isabel. I'm going to bring Christianity to these places. Who gave him the authority to show up at this place and to say he could do this? Well, it turns out he makes these claims and he comes back. And the church, this is before the Reformation, so there's still a single church. We call it the Roman or Catholic Church. Church endorses this. And in the 1490s, the debate is not, can Spanish just take whatever they want from the Americas? It's where do we draw the line from where the Portuguese can go and where the Spanish can go?
Well, I mean, it's not dissimilar to the kind of paradox of the alcohol. The church knows what he's doing is objectively wrong. They have to. at the same time, they think, well, if it ends up with a whole bunch of people being saved and being, converted to enthusiastic religion du jour, I guess, then it's, I guess, maybe worth it. I feel as if, it's interesting how people interact with other ways of life. You can look at, well, I mean, number one, right? So there's like the rule saying you're ordained by the Catholic Church, which is kind of this like, was it the Catholic Church? Okay. Yeah. You are, I always like fuck up like Protestants and Puritans and whatever. It is
on my book also.
It is your right to go and claim these things in places where they do not have this established. So if they don't have this established, it's like, you got it. Is that like pretty accurate?
So here's the problem. So that's accurate. That's mostly accurate. But here's the problem. When Europeans had gone to East Asia earlier, they didn't lay claim to them. They found places like Marco Polo and all that. They find these places in India and China, and they don't say, we own them. Something different happened. I mean, the difference
I think,
good.
So that's kind of what I was working up to. It's like, if I am wearing a t-shirt, right? And it could be because like, that's just what I wear. And there's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't make me a smarter person or a dumber person. But if you come wearing a 3-piece suit, you're going to look at your suit, you're going to look at my t-shirt, you could be like, I'm better, right? If you have that kind of infrastructure, if you come from that infrastructure and you see like a place, and I think that to your point with like East Asia and India, it's like, these are really established non-nomadic, societies. And even like the non-nomadic ones in America, right? They're like mostly living in long huts and stuff like that. Is that accurate?
Well, the architectural size vary across the Americas. So there's
well, I mean, sure. I'm saying the first people that they would have seen.
So the first people that Columbus sees are living in huts of different sizes. And we have descriptions of Hispaniola, of modern day Haiti and the Dominican Republic.
Okay.
Yeah, they're living in these fairly, not the most durable houses. If a hurricane came by, probably blew them down. But houses, like recognizable houses, and recognizable houses of different sizes, which seems to suggest a hierarchy. And the Europeans immediately try to learn how to communicate with people, which they do very quickly, and try to learn about native use of plants, native economies, native religion. They describe it. But the larger goal, the official larger goal of all of these Europeans is that they're going to spread Christianity. It gets more complicated after the Protestant Reformation, at the end of the 1510s, when you have Protestants and Catholics who want to spread their brand of Christianity before the other gets there. So that feeds into certain 17th century debates. Does not happen so early. Anyway.
They just want to, they want to do the equivalent of beat the Nazis. We have not gotten to the communist versus capitalism like divergence yet.
Yeah, that's not a bad analogy. Yes.
Yeah. Of course, the natives not Nazis. That's not what I'm getting at.
Yes. I don't want any. No, I've never said that. Yes. So let's get rid of that analogy.
No, the analogy extends in a very certain way.
I'll leave. It's your podcast.
Okay.
Anyway, there are these debates about how should Europeans treat native peoples in the Americas. And the reason Columbus gets in trouble, and he's sent back in chains on his third voyage, is that word gets to Spain that he is enslaving Taínos. And the Queen says basically, you can't do that because once you laid claim of this island and these peoples, they became my subjects. You can't enslave my subjects, right? And so then they have this big debate. Well, who and when could they enslave? Well, you could enslave someone you captured in war, or you could say whatever. But the Vatican is in on these discussions, right? And so they have this big thing, but the overarching narrative is basically a series of justifications that allows for European expansion. And it takes multiple forms. So Europeans may share that they want to spread Christianity, which is embedded in basically like every colonial charter is like, we're going to spread Christianity. That's what we're going to do. We'll make some money. We'll take some people over, but we're going to expand the faith. That's all there. But then there's all these other currents of people competing against each other. Who's going to be there first? What Europeans are going to put their flag somewhere? There's sort of stories which seem to be semi-apocryphal of northern places, especially where people would claim possession by rituals in which they would grab some of the dirt, for example, and engage ritual, or they would take a post and they would nail like a coin with the monarch on it and say, this is our territory. And then other people would come by and just take it down and say, this is nonsense. I mean, and I mean this only positively towards all my friends in Canada, but one of the founding myths of Canada is that Champlain founds this place. There aren't very many French people there in the early 17th century, and Canada is a really big country. And so the colonial population in the 17th century, go to the end of the 17th century, is so tiny compared to the indigenous population, but on every European map, it's French Canada, right? And on all European maps, the English claim this and the English and the Spanish, blah, blah, blah. And these maps become these, though they're fictions, they're also scripts that sort of justify conquest. This is ours. Columbus said it was ours, or whoever said it was ours, and therefore we can go and we can take what we want and do what we will to the people who live there.
It's strange the ways that we justify kind of like taking shit. It is really strange the ways that we justify expansion, what it means, why it's important that we do these things. Essentially, like, why is it important that we take more than our share?
Good way of asking the question.
Luckily, it seems as if, with exception, maybe just because we ran out of things to take, and now we can only fight over, I don't know, little slivers of land, strips you might call them. It's weird how like a direct confrontation has become these like strange like political maneuverings. And do you think we'll ever get over that as like folks? Like as people, do you think people will ever stop trying to like, you can use like the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. You can use like, Israel-Gaza. You can use all of these. Do you think people will ever stop doing that to each other?
Wow. So historians are notoriously bad about what's to come in the future.
Well, I thought the whole point that we've learned history, you're doomed to repeat it.
Well, I think we learn history, so we learn how we got to where we are to inform us as we go forward. It's an interesting sort of a question, but I do think, so I study this 700 years, and I tell a lot of stories of individuals, people that, the reader won't have heard of, and I hope that the stories make certain points. And I try to get at people to sort of rethink things that we take for granted, we assume, right? So if you were to say to someone, what's early America about? And I think some people would say, well, among things that Europeans did, when you take away the terrible things that they did, enslavement and the diseases that they inadvertently brought, you take away those things, what are the positives in sort of the national myth and how we talk about it? Self-government. Like, isn't self-government a good thing? That's really what leads to the revolution, the idea of self-government. And religious freedom. Like, religious freedom is a good idea. And every Thanksgiving rolls around, and here come the pilgrims trotting out. It's always wintertime. It's always snowy. They're in these heavy clothes, and they're never having any fun, and they're never having any sex, but they are there for religious freedom, right? They become these beacons of these things. So we have self-government and religious freedom. Okay. What I tried to do here is to say these are actually complicated concepts. It's going to get into your question. Native peoples were self-governing before Europeans got there. There were self-governing polities across the Americas before Europeans got there. They didn't need to learn this from Europeans. People point to the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact was 100 people on a boat who basically say, let's help each other out and listen to each other. It's not the beginning of self-government. People point to the beginning of the House of Burgesses in Virginia in 1619, self-government in America. Yes, for English colonists in the Chesapeake region, they have going into a new form of self-government, but self-government as a concept predates it. Religious freedom. Those pilgrims. The pilgrims are everywhere when we talk about religious freedom. The pilgrims and the Puritans are kind of the same. They share most of their beliefs. There's slight differences between them, which will only bore people to get into it. Religious freedom. It's a story that presumes the triumph of Christianity. Okay? They are persecuted at home for their religious beliefs, for their way of practicing Christianity. And so they go to a new world, as they would have called it, to do that. Okay. Well, religious freedom goes lots of different ways. And I end my book with the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 because the Pueblo Revolt was about religious freedom. But the religious freedom was about the Puebloan peoples trying to eradicate the Catholic Church from New Mexico. They killed priests wherever they could find them. They killed the soldiers guarding the priests. They destroyed any religious icon they could find. They burned down the churches. The leader of this rebellion, whose name is Pope, once they've kicked the Spaniards out, Spaniards flee into Santa Fe, then they escape. And there aren't Spanish people in New Mexico for 12 years after the Pueblo Revolt. I mean, it's a hugely successful moment. Pope has his followers take a yucca root, anyone who'd been baptized by a priest, and scrub the Christianity off their body, right? To basically say, that is about religious freedom as much as the pilgrims are about religious freedom. But our myth only has room for one of them. So you go to the question, are people always going to try to get more, right? Is this part of like human nature? Does these hundreds of years in my book tell us something foundational about human nature? And I think the answer is yes. I do think that certainly in certain cultures, acquisition becomes the highest value. And acquisition deemed broadly. Acquisition in our modern society would be about money. How many billionaires do we have these days? Acquisition in the 15th century in the minds of the church was acquiring more souls for Christianity. Acquisition to a fur trader, an English fur trader in the mid-17th century. Yeah, I'm going to sell rum to these people. No, it's a bad idea because I want the money that selling those furs are going to be about. Like acquisition becomes a foundational thing. Native peoples and Europeans, and we haven't talked much about Africans, have different core values in many ways. And there are huge differences between these populations. All native peoples don't think the same. All Europeans don't think the same. All Africans don't think the same way. But there is, to get at your core question, if you looked at my laboratory of human experience in North America from about 1000 to 1680, there are countless examples of people who want what they've always wanted, more. They just want more. The more may differ, but that's what they want. And the Europeans who managed to conquer and colonize North America, where they succeed, they get kicked out of New Mexico, but where they succeed and they want to expand because they just want more based on their sense of values. So you say, is that a fundamental human thing? It is absolutely an early modern thing among the peoples who I studied.
We talked a lot about things that get left out of history, the kind of stuff that you plumbed for the Hudson book, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a time where those records are not, like, they don't have the same, I mean, some of them did, but by and large, they didn't have the same permanence as something like that happened in the 20th century, right? Because it's more sophisticated. We have better ways of keeping it. The records that were kind of intentionally kind of sort of fell to the wayside. Do you think that those things fell to the wayside to insulate the survivors? And not like the direct survivors. I mean, the people who, as a national shame, it would have been traumatic too. Or do you think that, it was kind of to preserve legacy? And those sound the same, but they're different. You know, I one of them's born out of shame. One's born out of like not quite a hubris, but certainly a modicum of pride.
Yeah. So I think that they did not have a modern sensibility about that. I think that there were stories that they didn't like, but I'll give you an example. Kind of one of the more amazing things to me. In early Jamestown, the colonists are starving. And we know this because we have a couple of records about it. And we know this because there's an archaeological remains of a skeleton known as Jane found in Jamestown with markings on her skull and bones that indicate that she was cannibalized, that they ate her and some of this. And then they tossed her bones into a kitchen where it's found. So it's unclear how they disposed of the body, because that's where it's found in the modern day. Okay. Now you got to say to yourself, cannibalism, that's pretty bad, right? Cannibalism is so bad that even Columbus is saying, we can go to these islands because there aren't cannibals here. Well, I hear there's cannibals over there, but these are okay, right? Cannibalism is a fear throughout European society. Okay. 1610, 1611, in order to promote colonization of Jamestown, the Virginia Company, which controls Jamestown from 1607 till 1624, puts out a pamphlet in which they say, yeah, there's a guy who chopped up his wife and salted down the pieces. And we're telling the story because he's the only one who did it. In other words, they admit to something which they could have hidden. Who knows how that story was circulated, but they admit to it, and they admit to it in a narrative in which that sort of confession becomes a way to say, but see, we're really figuring out how to go forward. The documents reveal all these moments where they're hyper aware of how precarious it is what they're doing, that death was around the corner, that failure was around the corner. So there's a quirky little testimony from New Haven was a colony originally, a New Haven colony, in which the wife of the governor got into various fights, and people wrote about this. And there's some testimony about this. And they have a fight in the house, and screaming, and someone hits one another. And the person recording this says, and they just think their whole little family's falling apart. The person recording it, basically, they realize there are two native people in the house. And they say, we have to stop, not because she's causing trouble. This becomes a whole court case. But because we're fighting in front of them, and we need to give them, that is the native peoples, we have to tell them that we're all basically on the same page, that we're all in agreement. They will see, if they see us doing this, why would they listen to us? Whereas, we're bad people. They are aware at this little intimate moment, which doesn't appear in any history book. I found an article in one journal about this. It's one of these moments of insight that they are aware that even though I would say from the distance of 500 years, 400 years, this idea of that they're going to succeed and colonize, they're aware they can fail. When the Spanish are leaving New Mexico in 1680, they are writing down the descriptions of the place that the Pueblos have destroyed. It is a testimony to the weakness of their colonial vision to basically say, oh my God, we thought we had this in hand. We don't. I talk about 1680 and the Pueblo Revolt because I like telling a story about the West. We're in the West. I like talking about the West. But from 1675 to 1680, there are other rebellions. There's an aborted slave rebellion on Barbados, which gets suppressed in a hugely violent way. There is something called Bacon's Rebellion, in which poor white upcountry farmers go and basically burn the capital of Jamestown and chase the governor away before Bacon himself dies of probably dysentery. There's a rebellion of native peoples led by Narragansetts and Wampanoags that basically destroys much of colonial New England. It's the most destructive war ever in New England history. At the end of these conflicts, there are charred bodies, charred churches, drowned people. There's one story of testimony in New England where some native soldiers, fighters, had taken some colonial ships, The colonists managed to capture them back, capture 2 young guys, and with testaments, guys gives a testimony, capture them, and the ship comes from Marblehead. So they take the ship back to Marblehead, these 2 guys on it, and these women who have been their colonial women, according to a colonial witness, push the soldiers out of the way, get these 2 guys and beat them to death with their hands. Right? This is not the kind of story we typically think about when we think about early America. But here you have these English American white women doing this murderous act. These guys were taken captive to be taken to court. They might have ended up being executed. We don't know what would have happened. But in point of fact, there's this mob mentality, but of people who we would not assume would perpetrate violence. That doesn't fit our national myth. Right? So, what is it about the meeting of these different peoples that brings out such savage violence? I mean, enslavement is just such a brutal institution day after day after day. And yet it is embedded in Virginia, which becomes the place that's famous for producing Thomas Jefferson and others, of course, has his own very complicated torture relationship, with the institution of slavery. Is this human? Is this whatever? I don't know, but there's something in the water, and it's often not good.
Yeah.
That sounds such a downer. Please read the book. There are a lot of good things, happy stories too.
Well, I think, not that I am trying to justify it. I'm trying to understand it is what I'm trying to do. But I think, once you're an ocean away from everything you ever knew, or, you're just recently generationally removed from that, like, you're playing for keeps. People do a lot of stuff. I would never in my normal life go try to fight a grizzly bear. If I'm way back in the wilderness, I'm being attacked by a grizzly bear, I'm going to try to fight a grizzly bear. It's like the context is what informs the action. But the question remains, it's, hey man, maybe you just shouldn't be fucking around with our grizzly bears. It's not really the grizzly bear's fault. The grizzly bear is doing what it sees you in its home. It's the home that it has been in for millennia and millennia and millennia. You show up one day, I might not be stoked you're there. Because talking to Etta Fields Black, she's the woman that we did, she's the Pulitzer Prize winner who did Comby. She had sometimes a weird level, this is in her estimation, this isn't me like judging her level, a weird level of sympathy for some of the people who you would think that she would have no sympathy for because they were the oppressors. She could still see the humanity within some of these folks who were doing these terrible things. Do you find yourself having a similar experience?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, if you just relegate people to a category, and you just assume their actions because of some external elements of their identity, whether they're a plantation owner and there's a bunch of enslaved people, whether they're leading, soldiers against unarmed people. It's not that you end up supporting them, but you do have to understand them. So I often point to one of the really infamous moments in early American history, and this is in a lot of textbooks. In 1637, English colonists in the New England colonies of Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Connecticut are convinced that there's going to be a rebellion against them by the Pequot Indians. And they're convinced that the Pequots are going to ally with the Narragansetts, basically an adjacent indigenous tribe or nation,
Sure.
whichever word. And they're basically going to cut off the fur trade and they're going to force the English out. And the English really believe this is going to happen. And so the English create an alliance with the Narragansetts, and they form a partnership with them to attack the Pequots. And the most famous work of history in early America is William Bradford's Plymouth Plantation. Hardly anyone reads anymore. It's really an amazing work of literature because Bradford is always trying to describe events as he understands them, but he understands them through a very specific scriptural lens. He sees the people who we call pilgrims and the Puritans who are nearby. He sees them as basically living out a divine plan that God had set at the beginning of time. It's just they don't know what's going to happen, but they are agents of God. And you see that all sorts of ways. So in 1637, they're fighting the Pequots. They surround a village on the Mystic River, and they set it on fire. And by their estimates, not indigenous estimates, by colonial estimates, they kill in a single night 400 to 700 people. They shoot people as they are fleeing the flames. They shoot people who they know are defenseless. They are shooting them, right, with arrows or guns, killing them. Okay. Bradford writes about this in the Plymouth Plantation. So you read this, and he describes this. And then you get to the end of his basically long paragraph about this. And he basically says, God did it, right? We are basically the agents of God. This is how God decided to smite a haughty, proud, insufferable people. We didn't do it. So you can read that, as many people read it, and say, well, that's just, they want to get off the hook for committing a war crime because it's atrocious what they did, and they want to say it wasn't them. Historian, turning to that, basically says, how can people who are doing things which you celebrate in other parts of their history engage in this war crime? And the trick is to try to understand it. So the trick with that passage is to read it to the end, that they really thought they were the hand of God. And I mean, that's not the wording he would use, but whatever. Do I have empathy for Bradford? It's horrible what they did. I don't justify that. I don't say just because they believed it, it's okay. But I think you have to understand what they're doing. And that's what I try to do with these examples. And in the period that I write about, in the 16th and 17th century, often I only have one side of the debate. I have documents produced by Europeans. I don't have many produced by native peoples. I don't have many produced by enslaved Africans, right? I have a very limited, I have a lot of documents, but it's limited in its perspective. But you got to read into them, people describing those women in Marblehead beating those two guys to death. What happens in the Pequot War? What happens in the Pueblo Revolt? The Pueblo Revolt, which I described as Pueblos seeking religious freedom, comes out of generations of hostility between Spaniards and Puebloan peoples, which goes way back to the beginning, the end of the 16th century when Spanish moved north into New Mexico, and a group of soldiers show up at Acoma. Acoma is this fantastic, longest continuous settled place in the current United States. It's a fantastic city. They show up at Acoma, and these soldiers demand food and whatever, and the people of Acoma say no, and the skirmish happens, and about a dozen Spanish soldiers are killed. I'm not trying to make light of that. The Spanish get word of this and come back. And not only do they kill, per the estimates of even the National Park Service, so hardly some radical organization, hundreds of people, they systematically chop off people's hands and feet so that they will survive and walk around as a visible reminder not to stand up against colonization. So when under Pope in 1680, they rebel, there's a long tradition of them saying, no, it's enough. People have these long histories. We often don't have the pieces in between. Historians don't. So I hope I've developed empathy to understand these in the time. Because when you read the testimony of the Pueblo Revolt, it's pretty hard reading, some of it. Just like reading about the Pequot War, the Anglo-Pequot War, as we should call it, is pretty hard reading. So I try to understand it, even people who I find horrible. And I run into a lot of horrible people, and I try to, I hope, explain what they did, and then to put them as characters in a large narrative tableau that tells the history of this continent over these centuries.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's like the thing. Being able to understand something is not the same as justifying it. We were talking earlier about Robert Plott. It's like, yeah, well, the dude thought the first dinosaur bone was a human femur, or is it the femur of a David and Goliath-esque giant? Because, like, I don't know, that's what people knew back then. And so it's like, do I think that makes it like scientifically like good? As if we should hold that up by today's standards and be like, yup. And if he came to that conclusion today, it would be totally acceptable. No, it'd be absolutely ridiculous. Can I understand in the context of like yesteryear, like why that happened? Of course I can. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. That's why I think what you do in, these books, that being, Fatal Journey and that being Contested Continent, coming out June 1st. You do what great writing does, which is it builds not only, essential plot and conflict, but it builds this secondary conflict in that it makes you understand both sides of the thing. And that kind of nuanced understanding, it's like difficult. It's harder to reckon with as like a reader or a writer for that matter. But that's the only way that you give people nuanced perspectives of the entirety of situations. And I think that's what makes narratives so effective. And I can see why you write the way you do, man.
Well, Hayden, that is high compliment, and I would drop the mic if it was not attached to the stand right now. Thank you. That was
you bet, man. You bet.
Thank you.
Fatal Journey. This is out. It's been out 2009. It's an unbelievable accounting of the final expedition of Henry Hudson. Contested Continent out June 1st. Really a cool project. We're going to have all sorts of links, and I'll be posting about it when it comes out. And thank you so much for coming on and talking.
Thank you, Hayden.
to us,
Thank
man.
you for bringing me here, and it was a huge pleasure.
You
Thank
bet,
you.
man. All right, hey, we'll catch you guys next time. More cool stuff.
It's fishing. You use a lure, and you have a line, and you have a rod, and you torture them for a few minutes, and then you bring them in, and you either eat them or release them.
Yeah.
So it's just another way of fishing, and people describe it as an art. People who have never done it, don't really know anything, and they always do this. Yeah, it's like this art. It's like this art.
Shadow casting.
Yeah, and it's not an art. I don't even know if it's a sport. I don't know what to call it. But it's you got to be in some ways a predator,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's more intimate than other kinds of fishing because it's less mechanical. You're doing more stuff with your hands all the time. You're always moving. I mean, it's not sitting on a bank, waiting for a fish to bite. So people that are ADD or, have a lot of energy, enjoy fly fishing because there's always something going on and
Perpetually active.
Perpetually active, yeah. And they talk about fly fishing actually as being a really great therapy for people to kind of lose their problems for a while and chill because you really can't think of anything else. I mean, it's a cliche, right?
Sure.
If you're in the fly fishing world, it's a cliche, but you can't think of anything else. You're always concentrating and you're constantly looking, you're hunting, there's a lot of aspects of hunting in fly fishing because you're stalking fish most of the time.